Step into the light of a chrome ascension, where the weight of the past is finally lifted and a new era begins. Witness the transformation of ordinary lives into extraordinary legends through our signature 3D cinematic storytelling. Hit that subscribe button now and rise to a new level of imagination with us. The call went to voicemail. Again, I stood in the parking garage of my office building, keys in one hand, phone in the other, listening to my wife's voice on the recording, warm, familiar, asking me to leave a message. I hung up without speaking. That was the fourth time in 2 days. Eleanor never let a call go to voicemail. Not mine, anyway. 29 years of marriage, and I could count on one hand the times she hadn't picked up when I called. I told myself there was an explanation. She was probably in the shower. Or maybe the signal was bad at my son's apartment building. That high-rise on the edge of downtown had always been spotty on the upper floors. I had mentioned it to my son, Daniel, more than once. He always shrugged it off the way he shrugged off most things I said. I got in the car and sat there for a moment. Engine off, listening to the silence of the garage around me. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it any better than that. It was the kind of feeling that settles in the back of your chest and refuses to move. Not quite fear, not quite dread, but something uncomfortably close to both. Eleanor had driven up to visit Daniel and his wife, Sasha, 3 days earlier. She went alone because I had a project deadline I couldn't move. The plan was simple. She'd spend a few days with them, I'd finish my work, and then I'd drive up Friday evening to join them for the weekend. That was the plan. It was Tuesday night, and I hadn't heard her voice since Sunday morning. I tried Daniel's phone next. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I tried Sasha's number and got the same result. I sat there staring at the screen, running through reasonable explanations and finding none of them satisfying. Maybe they all went somewhere without cell coverage. Maybe there was a family dinner and they'd all silenced their phones. Maybe I was being the kind of paranoid, overbearing husband my son had accused me of being more than once. But Eleanor always called. That was the thing. Even when she was annoyed with me, even when we'd argued before she left, she called. Every evening, without fail. It was something we had done since the early years of our marriage, when I traveled for work and she stayed home with Daniel. We kept the habit long after it became necessary, because we both wanted to. That was who we were. I started the car and pulled out of the garage. I wasn't going home. The drive to Daniel's building took 40 minutes without traffic. I made it in 34. I parked in the visitor lot and walked through the lobby, nodding at the doorman, riding the elevator to the 18th floor. The hallway was quiet, the way expensive buildings always are. Carpet thick enough to swallow footsteps, lighting warm and low. I walked to unit 1807 and raised my hand to knock. Before my knuckles touched the door to unit 1805 opened. A woman stepped out. She was somewhere in her early 70s. Small and sharp-eyed, wearing a cardigan over her pajamas like someone who had been awake a long time. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, relief and hesitation mixed together in equal parts. "Are you Martin?" she asked. I lowered my hand. "Yes. How did you know that?" "Your wife showed me a picture of you," she said. "On her phone, the first night she arrived. She said you'd be coming Friday. I've been hoping you'd come sooner." She glanced at Daniel's door, then back at me. "My name is Dorothy. I live right here. Please come inside for a moment before you knock." I should have found this strange. Looking back, I think part of me did. But there was something in her voice, a steadiness, a controlled urgency, that made me follow her without asking why. She closed the door behind us quietly and stood in the small entryway of her apartment, hands clasped in front of her, studying me. "Mr. Martin," she said, "I need to tell you something about your wife." The world went very still. "She's not in there," Dorothy said, nodding toward the shared wall between her unit and Daniel's. "She hasn't been in there since Sunday morning." I know because I heard the ambulance. I heard the whole thing. I heard myself say, "What ambulance?" Dorothy led me to her couch and sat down across from me. She was calm in the way people become calm after they've been frightened for a very long time and have used up all their panic. She told me what she knew in a quiet, deliberate voice, watching my face as she spoke. On Sunday morning, she had been awake early, reading by the window. She heard a commotion in the hallway, raised voices, a door opening and closing. Then, through the wall, she heard a woman's voice, weak and confused, asking for water. Dorothy had lived alone long enough to recognize the difference between ordinary noise and the sound of someone in distress. She had pressed her ear to the wall and heard something that made the hair on her arms stand up. The voice was barely recognizable, slurring badly, as if the person speaking had almost no strength left. She had opened her front door and seen Daniel standing in the hallway with his phone in his hand, facing away from her. She had asked if everything was all right. He turned around and told her quickly, firmly, in the tone people use when they want you to believe something is settled, that his mother had a little too much to drink the night before and just needed rest. Dorothy had looked past him at the apartment door and felt the wrongness of it the same way I had felt something wrong in that parking garage. She had gone back inside and called 911. Daniel had come to her door minutes later, angry, telling her she'd overreacted and embarrassed the family, and that the paramedics were going to leave as soon as they saw there was nothing wrong. But the paramedics had not left. They had taken Eleanor out on a stretcher, oxygen mask over her face, and Dorothy had watched through her peephole as my son stood in the hallway with his arms crossed and did not get in the ambulance. He had not followed. She told me the name of the hospital. I was standing before she finished the sentence. I don't remember the drive to Street Clements Medical Center clearly. I remember parking incorrectly, somewhere I wasn't supposed to park. I remember the automatic doors of the emergency entrance. I remember saying my wife's name to a woman at the front desk and watching her face change. They brought me to a doctor, a tired man in his 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, who asked me to sit down. I told him I preferred to stand. He told me Eleanor had been admitted Sunday morning in a state of severe respiratory depression. Her blood pressure had been dangerously low. She had been unresponsive when the paramedics arrived. "Do you know if your wife takes any prescription medications?" he asked. "Blood pressure medication," I said. "A low dose?" "She's been on it for a few years. Nothing else." He nodded slowly. "We found warfarin in her system," he said, "at a level significantly above what would be prescribed therapeutically. We also found a sedative compound, not something she would have been prescribed." He paused. "We've notified the police, Mr. Martin. This isn't something that happened by accident." I stood in that hallway for a long time after he finished speaking. The officers who came to the hospital were professional and careful. They asked me questions in a small consultation room while Eleanor was upstairs in the ICU, still unconscious, machines doing the work her body could not yet do on its own. I answered everything they asked. I told them about Eleanor's visit, about the missed calls, about Dorothy. They already knew about Dorothy. She had given a statement Sunday evening. They asked me about Daniel's financial situation. I told them what I knew, which was more than I had ever said aloud to anyone, that Daniel had come to us 8 months ago with a story about bad investments, a technology venture that had collapsed, debts to partners, a situation that was, in his words, temporary but serious. He had asked if Eleanor and I would consider liquidating some of our retirement accounts to help him bridge the gap. I had said no. I had said no firmly, and the conversation had ended badly, and we had not spoken easily since. I told them about Sasha, too, how she had started calling Eleanor more frequently after that, how she had asked, gently at first, and then with increasing persistence, about our estate planning, whether we had updated our will recently, whether we had considered putting Daniel on certain accounts just for convenience, just in case something happened to us. Eleanor had mentioned these conversations to me with a vague unease she couldn't quite articulate. I had told her Sasha was probably just being practical. I had been wrong about that. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Reyes. She was precise and unhurried, in the way good investigators always are. She came to see me the following morning, while I was sitting with Eleanor, who was still unconscious, still pale, still terrifyingly small against the hospital pillows, and she told me that the investigation was moving. "We've been looking at some activity on your son's devices," she said carefully. "I can't share specifics while we're still gathering information. But I want to ask you something directly." She looked at me. "Were you aware that your son contacted an estate attorney 6 weeks ago?" I was not aware. She nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "The attorney won't discuss specifics due to privilege, but we know the contact was made." We're also looking at pharmacy records and some recent purchases. I didn't ask what purchases. I think part of me already understood. On the fourth day, Eleanor opened her eyes. I had barely left the room. I had slept in the chair by the window for 2 nights, waking at every change in the sound of the monitors. And I was there when she came back, when her eyelids moved and she turned her head and found my face with her eyes the way she always did when she woke up, as if checking that I was still there. "Martin," she said. The word came out rough and barely above a whisper, but it was her voice. It was completely her voice. I reached for her hand and held it, and could not speak for a moment. She was confused at first, the way people are when consciousness returns in pieces rather than all at once. She didn't understand where she was. She thought she'd been sick a bad flu, she kept saying. She'd felt so dizzy after dinner Saturday night. She didn't remember Sunday morning at all. She didn't remember the paramedics. She didn't remember any of it. I told her she was safe. I told her I was there. I didn't tell her the rest, not yet. She was too fragile, and I was not ready to say out loud what I knew was true. The nurses brought water. Eleanor sipped it slowly, still holding my hand, and eventually her eyes stayed open, and her breathing steadied, and she asked me where Daniel was. I told her he hadn't been able to make it to the hospital yet. She accepted this and didn't push. Eleanor had always been more generous with our son than I was. She believed in his goodness with a persistence that I had sometimes found touching and sometimes found exhausting. Detective Reyes came back on the 5th day. She sat across from me in the family consultation room while Eleanor slept, and she spread several printed pages on the table between us. One of them was a screenshot. It showed search history from a browser, a series of queries entered over the course of several weeks. The queries were about warfarin dosing, about drug interactions between anticoagulants and sedatives, about how quickly certain compounds cleared from the bloodstream. The browser history belonged to Daniel's laptop. There was more. Reyes walked me through it methodically, the way someone does when they want to make sure you understand completely and cannot later say you misunderstood. A cash purchase at a pharmacy 30 minutes from Daniel's apartment, 3 weeks before Eleanor's visit. A deleted email thread between Daniel and Sasha that the digital forensics team had partially recovered fragments that referenced a timeline, referenced before the quarter ends, referenced a phrase that made my stomach turn. It has to look natural. I sat with that phrase for a long time. The arrest happened 2 days later. I wasn't there. Reyes had advised me to stay at the hospital, and I understood why if I had been there. I don't know what I would have done with my hands. I know what I was feeling. I know it was not something I can easily name, even now. It was grief for the son I had raised, and rage at the person he had become, and underneath both of those, a sorrow so deep it had no visible bottom. Eleanor was moved out of the ICU the day before the arrest. She was still weak, still sleeping more than she was awake, still confused by the gaps in her memory. I hadn't told her yet. I was waiting for the doctors to tell me she was stable enough to hear something that would shake her to the foundation of who she was. They told me on a Thursday afternoon. I walked back to her room and sat down beside the bed, and took her hand again. I told her everything. She listened without speaking. I watched her face move through things. I had no words for disbelief first, then a terrible understanding, then something that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but some combination of both that settled around her eyes and stayed there. When I finished, she was quiet for a very long time. "He didn't come to the hospital," she finally said. "It was not a question." "No," I said. She closed her eyes. I held her hand and said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be adequate. The investigation took 4 months. It was, in Reyes's words, a strong case. The digital evidence was substantial. The pharmacy records were clear. A receipt from a kitchen scale, found in a drawer in Daniel and Sasha's apartment, matched the type used to measure small quantities of pharmaceutical compound. A text message, recovered from Sasha's deleted files, contained a date, the Saturday evening Eleanor had arrived, and the single word "tonight." Sasha's attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement. She agreed to testify against Daniel in exchange for a reduced charge. I found out about this from Reyes on a gray November morning, and I sat with it for a long time before I decided how I felt. Sasha had been in the apartment. Sasha had made dinner Saturday night. Sasha had been the one to put Eleanor to bed, according to what Eleanor could piece together from her fractured memory of that evening. Whatever Sasha's role had been in the planning, she had been present for the execution of it. The cooperation agreement felt insufficient. I said as much to Reyes. Reyes said she understood, and I believed her. Daniel's trial began in February. Eleanor attended every day. I had tried to convince her to stay home. She was still not fully recovered, still tiring easily, still managing some lasting effects of what the warfarin had done to her blood. But she sat in the courtroom every morning, straight-backed, dressed carefully, watching the proceedings with an expression I came to understand over those weeks. It was not hatred. Eleanor was not built for hatred. It was something more complicated, and in some ways harder to carry. It was the face of a person who is learning, in real time, the full dimensions of a grief they did not choose. I sat beside her every day. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty on 2 counts of attempted murder. Guilty on 1 count of conspiracy. The judge set sentencing for 6 weeks later. I remember the moment the foreperson read it aloud. I remember the sound of Eleanor's breath beside me, a single sharp exhale, like something she'd been holding for months finally releasing. I reached for her hand and she took it, and for a moment we just sat there in that courtroom while the noise of the proceedings went on around us. Sentencing was on a cold morning in late March. Daniel stood at the defense table in a suit I didn't recognize, looking thinner than he had in November, looking in some fundamental way like someone I had raised and also like someone I didn't know at all. The judge spoke for a long time before she reached the sentence itself. She said things about the particular cruelty of betrayal within families. She said things about premeditation and about the evidence of planning that had begun months before the crime. She said that what had been done here was not an act of desperation but an act of calculation. The sentence was 23 years. Sasha received 8, with the possibility of parole after 5, in exchange for her testimony. Eleanor and I walked out of the courthouse together into the pale spring sunlight. She didn't speak for a long time. We sat in the car in the parking lot, and I didn't start the engine. After a while, she said, "I keep trying to remember when it changed, when he became someone who could do this." She paused. "I don't think I'll ever find the answer to that." "I don't think it's a question we're supposed to be able to answer," I said. She was quiet again. Then she reached over and took my hand from the steering wheel and held it in both of hers, the way she used to hold it when we were young, when everything ahead of us was still unknown and we were walking toward it together. "I want to go somewhere," she said. "Somewhere we've never been. I don't want to go home yet." So we drove. We didn't have a destination. We ended up at a state park 40 minutes outside the city, a place with a trail along a river, and we walked it slowly because Eleanor still tired easily, and the trees were just beginning to show the first green of the season, and we didn't talk much. There wasn't much that needed to be said. A few weeks later, we met with our own attorney, not the one Daniel had called, not the estate lawyer whose records had been subpoenaed during the investigation. Our attorney. We updated everything. We established a trust, structured the way our attorney recommended, with clear protections and clear language. We named a charity we had supported for many years as the primary beneficiary of the estate. We made these decisions together over several appointments, methodically and without sentimentality. Eleanor said, as we left the attorney's office the last time, that it felt like locking a door that should have been locked long ago. Dorothy came to visit us once, after Eleanor was fully recovered. She drove down from the city on a Saturday in April, and we had lunch together at our kitchen table, the 3 of us, and it was a quiet and good afternoon. Eleanor had baked, which she hadn't done in months, and Dorothy ate 2 pieces of the apple cake and said it was the best she'd ever had, and Eleanor laughed for the first time in what felt like a very long time. Before Dorothy left, Eleanor hugged her in the doorway for a long moment without saying anything. Dorothy patted her back gently, and then pulled away and looked at her and said, "You have good color now. That's what I wanted to see." I shook Dorothy's hand at the door. She looked up at me. She was a small woman. I had to look down, and she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "I almost didn't come out that night. I almost told myself it wasn't my business." She shook her head slightly. I'm glad I didn't listen to that part of myself. I told her I was too. It seemed completely inadequate. It was all I had. After she left, Eleanor and I sat on the back porch for a while as the afternoon light changed. The yard was coming back after a long winter, the first crocuses along the fence, the grass greening at the edges. Eleanor had her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold and was looking at the yard with a quiet expression I had learned over 29 years to read accurately. It was the expression she wore when she was trying to hold something difficult and something good at the same time, when she was learning to carry both of them together. "We should plant something this year," she said. "Something new." "What kind of something?" She thought about it. "I don't know yet. Something that comes back every year." I said that sounded right to me. I still think about the evening in that parking garage, the feeling that came over me when Eleanor's voicemail picked up for the fourth time. The way the silence of the garage felt suddenly like a warning. People talk about instinct as if it's something separate from reason, something you should probably override. I've come to believe the opposite. Instinct is the sum of everything you know about the people you love, calculating faster than conscious thought, and arriving at a conclusion before you can explain it. I knew something was wrong before I could have told you why. I drove because of that knowing. Eleanor is well. She is fully recovered, the doctors tell us, though she takes additional monitoring now, and probably always will. She walks every morning, which is a new habit since the hospital, something she started because a physical therapist recommended it, and kept up because she found she liked the early mornings alone with her thoughts. Sometimes I join her. Sometimes she wants the solitude, and I understand that and let her have it. We talk about Daniel less than you might expect. Not because we are avoiding it, but because we have said most of what there is to say. The grief of it doesn't require constant revisitation. It is simply there, the way permanent things are present, manageable, part of the structure of what our lives are now. What I know is this: we are still here. We still share the same house, the same table, the same evenings. When I wake in the night, I can hear Eleanor breathing in the dark, and I am every time quietly and deeply grateful for the sound of it. That gratitude is not something that has faded. I think it is something that will stay. Dorothy was right. She almost didn't come out into that hallway. She almost let herself believe it wasn't her business. I have thought about the other version of that night, the one where Dorothy stays inside, where the call to 911 is never made, where the ambulance doesn't come. I try not to think about it for too long, but I think about it enough to understand what we owe her. I think about it enough to understand that sometimes a stranger's choice is the thing that holds the rest of your life together. If Eleanor and I have learned anything from all of this, it is that the people who love you will show up. Sometimes they are the people you expect, and sometimes they are the woman next door in a cardigan and pajamas who heard something through the wall and decided, despite every reasonable impulse to stay out of it, that it was her business, after all. We planted tulip bulbs that autumn. They came up red the following spring, all along the back fence, more of them than we expected. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window looking at them on the first morning they bloomed and called me over to see. I came and stood beside her, and we looked at them together in the early light, and neither of us said anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying for us.